Thank you, Zafia. As Scott was saying, I am the newest member of the CLMR, so thank you all for having me, and Scott and Zafia for the kind invitation. A little bit of background on me. I'm a senior lecturer at the School of Tax and Business Law, and also the founding director of UNSW Tax Clinic. So the presentation's focus today will be a little bit of a meld of two opposite extremes of the taxation spectrum. So my PhD was on the topic of effectively super profit taxes and how we can implement fundamental reform that will lift the integrity of the tax base, if you will, when it comes to taxing multinationals. And the other extreme is the piece around equity. So the work that I do at the tax clinic is all about that notion of tax justice being a mechanism for social justice. And so that's the background for my talk today. The reason why COVID is relevant is because there's now been, and the observations are across the international tax academe, that COVID may be while it is a horrible and a horrifying circumstance, may be an opportunity for tax reform. And calls from people like Professor Alison Christians from McGill and other prominent tax professors that there may be an opportunity to do some really meaningful tax reform as a result of the new focus that COVID has brought to light. So COVID is prompting an existential shift in the way that we're thinking about the international tax system. A quote from Christians from just last week when she delivered a Leeds presentation online is COVID plus the digital tax disagreement creates a moment of reckoning. It exposes all the fault lines, inconsistencies and weaknesses. It's a moment where we can see there's political will to change, and now's our time, tax lawyers. And what I might add to Professor Christian's call to arms is it's our time potentially beyond just tax lawyers and people who research in the space of not just tax, but also market regulation and corporate governance to contribute to that development of tax policy and design. And so one way that Christians conceptualized it, and I thought it would be useful for today's session, because I appreciate that not everyone finds tax the most riveting of all topics. And so to contextualize it within the broader framework that we're operating in. So a lot of international tax, Gordon, thank you, I agree. A lot of topics that tax is focused on, particularly in international tax, are things like the US patent box regime. So there we've got IP rights and the allocation of taxing rights as a result of those. Other situations include the concept of value added and where across the supply chain are we going to allow jurisdictions to claim their tax, and that has implications in terms of market regulation, and definitely important part of all of this is political environment and bargaining power across different jurisdictions, and a lot of game theory at play as well. So tax isn't in a vacuum. There are so many elements of market regulation. So I very much want to open the invite for more of a workshop style to get your views from your unique perspectives, particularly given this center is about law, markets and regulations. So where we go through, and I'm going through concepts that may seem very tax focused, please shout out and let me know if you can in the chat or via the audio if there's anything you'd like to clarify or to define. So on that note, I might start with the economist perspective, but then noting that I myself am a lawyer and not an economist, and I suspect that is the same for the majority of participants on today's call. I'll spend a little bit of time on the economist perspective and then go straight into the lawyer's contribution in relation to what economists think is good tax design. So when we talk about super profits, And whether we call it a super profit or a rent tax or a global excess profits tax, it's all in the same sort of domain. And there are lots of different options that we can use when it comes to these sorts of fundamental reforms. And there's a list here from the OECD that looks at the different fundamental reform options and ranks them as to whether or not they achieve efficiency. And efficiency, of course, in the economist sense, is very different to the layperson sense. It's about minimizing as much as possible opportunities for tax-induced behavioral responses. And so of all of these fundamental reforms, the only one to really have been experimented with in practice across multiple jurisdictions is called an ACE. So that's the third one down. And the ACE stands for Allowance for Corporate Equity. I don't know if anybody on today's call has heard of an ACE before. It's always nicer to be in a room because I get a show of hands. But has anybody here heard of an ACE? No, so I know Gordon has and John has not. So what an ACE is, it tries to neutralize the tax treatment of otherwise fungible types of funds. So we've got debt and equity as your vanilla types of funding. At the moment, debt is deductible for tax purposes, whereas equity is not deductible. And in very limited jurisdictions, and Australia is one of the outliers, you have an ability to frank equity. But otherwise, there's no preferential sort of tax treatment for equity financing as opposed to debt financing. And this is important because it means that it creates this mismatch, this distortion, incentives for the use of one form over another. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that is the form that it will take overall, but it can mean that it can give rise to incentives to have things like hybrids and workarounds that are not the intention of policymakers. But what an ACE does is it gives you a deduction for the cost of your equity capital. So in that sense, it equalizes the tax treatment of debt and equity financing by making them both deductible. John, did that provide a neat enough summary? I'm happy to elaborate further if you'd like. Terrific. So that's been experimented with in practice, and there are ACE variants in jurisdictions like Belgium and Italy, and Brazil, Croatia, a few other countries have experimented with it too in practice. But the most prominent and useful ones for our purposes are the Belgian and the Italian ACE. Caveat is that ACEs are normally introduced in very dire economic times. And so when I was writing my PhD on this topic a few years ago, it felt like a little bit of a blue sky reform that may not ever see the light of day in the Australian context. However, looking at what is happening in global markets, I think COVID might be a good opportunity for us to rethink our tax systems, and fundamental reforms like these may be easy enough to implement given they've already been experimented with in practice. Hopefully I haven't lost anyone. How's everyone going? It's really hard to gauge the room because I can't see anyone. Any questions at this point? Oh, you're too kind, Gordon. Thank you. All right, so let's jump into then the lawyer's perspective, because economists' fundamental reform proposals and the ones that have been explored in the literature are useful, but once they go through the prism of the political sphere, and if they haven't been sanity checked by lawyers, I'm not going to say doomed to fail, but it's harder to get something through without first having the lawyer's perspective, is my not at all biased perception of things. So we know that economists have a notion that there or interchangeability between debt and equity financing in the context of multinationals. But what we also see is that lawyers have a significant amount of contribution and commentary that it's not just debt and equity. Indeed, academics like Ben Shalom say almost every type of tax deduction plan that uses affiliate financial transactions could be executed via other types of affiliated transactions. So what this is saying at its core is, if there is a tax preference, then it doesn't, if it's an intercompany cross-border transaction, and you already know that there are mismatches across tax systems and rates, both between and within systems when it comes to cross-border multinational transactions, then having differences is just going to create incentives for game playing. And that has implications from transfer pricing through to patents across the board, then can create incentives that might not be exactly what the policymakers intended initially. So there's a whole bunch of literature on the debt equity bias, but not so much in this space, asking, well, what's beyond debt and equity? And so my work is one of few that looks at this broader funding bias and says, if we're looking at a multinational, their intercompany cross-border transactions, it doesn't really matter how they're badged. As long as what we're looking at is some sort of funding, some sort of lump sum capital amount that's going from one entity in one jurisdiction to another and is resulting in a smaller flow of funds trickling back in a regular period, say, then that should be taxed the same, regardless of how it's badged, because of the issues around having something that is actually all controlled by the one multinational. So that's all well and good, but then how do we operationalize a super profits tax? How do we put this into practice in a way that is incremental enough that it's palatable, but also effective? So I model, as part of my PhD research that is now ongoing beyond my PhD, what a tax minimizing multinational would do, a hypothetical one, across borders with different types of financing available to it. And caveat on all of this, it is all just intercompany financing, not anything beyond that. And so the way that I've conceptualized research is the top-down approach of an economist and the bottom-up approach of a lawyer, and blending those two, that bridging that interdisciplinary gap that otherwise exists. I don't want to spend too much time on mapping the model for you, just because I don't want to lose you, and I know that I've only got limited time and I'd rather have your thoughts. So if anybody has any questions on the linear program that I've developed, then I'm more than happy to go through that, and so please do ask. But the top level is that I conceptualize it as an optimization model, the notion that the objective for the tax minimizing multinational is to minimize tax using intercompany transactions. And here is a visual representation of what those different options can look like and how those different funds can flow. So then once that is modeled for different types of reforms, we can see whether or not they are effective for this particular hypothetical multinational. And I also model different levels of tax aggression or risk appetite. And so looking at different rules, including the UK's current regime and the Belgian and Italian ACEs, we see that when it comes to vulnerability to profit shift, the ACE variants seem to be less vulnerable. And that may be mostly a product of the lower rate that the UK has at its corporate income tax headline level. But then the question is, how can we implement a super profits tax? And how will that be different to what we have now in terms of total revenue take? And will it give rise to unintended consequences? So the proposal that I have at the core of my PhD research is to blend the fundamental reforms that have already been proposed in the form of a cross-border combined ACE-CBIT. And so I don't want to spend too much time on defining the CBIT and the ACE and all the background literature there, because there is an absolute of literature there. But at its simplest, what that means is rather than a full ACE, we would have a partial ACE. So rather than a full deduction for the cost of equity, that notional cost of equity, it would be a partial deduction. And this is something that has already been conceptualized in the literature, including academics like the Centre for Business Tax, as highly regarded Professor Michael Devereux. What we would then see if that were to be road tested in the hypothetical multinational that I've modeled is that it would actually be a better way of protecting the tax revenue base if we do that, rather than just continue along the path of what the UK, for example, is doing, which is cutting corporate income tax rates. I'm mindful of the time, and so I'd much rather have your views and your suggestions and feedback. But the top level of what happens if we were to implement unilaterally a cross-border ACE-CBIT in the Belgian scenario, for example, is extracted on this slide here. And the core of it really, and what I've found through the modelling, is that the path that a lot of jurisdictions have headed down, this race to the bottom when it comes to corporate tax rates, is really a race that no one wins in. Reduction of corporate income tax headline rates, along with reduction of withholding rates, means that the collection of revenues, of course, is going to be lower. But if we had something like a cross-border ACE-CBIT, what it would do would give us a proxy for a super profits tax. It's really hard to design a super profits tax in a way that will be politically palatable because of all of the losers from it who would be more vocal than the winners. And so that's one of the challenges in tax design and reform. On that note, I might pause and give you all a moment for questions and also for Scott's presentation prior as well. Thank you.